Hello, and welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm, brought to you by funkinstuff.net. This is the interview show that gets deep in the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. I'm your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine, musicologist and author of Everything is on the One, the First Guide of Funk. If you don't have your copy, get on over to Amazon and pick one up. You'll be so glad you did, and so will I. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click on subscribe to hook up with the Funkin' Stuff channel on YouTube. That's where Truth and Rhythm lives and breathes. In addition to being on funkinstuff.net, there are also episodes on Daily Motion, and the audio podcast version is available on Spotify, iTunes, Google, just about everywhere. And most recently has been added to WTHL Urban Radio Cleveland. We're excited about that. And as well to Grown Folks Music. So the universe is expanding. But we still need your support, not only in subscribing, but also if you can help support this show to keep the lights on here. If you go to funkinstuff.net, on the right-hand side of the page, there's a donate option where you can contribute to help support this show about the artists that you love in funk, R&B, and jazz. Much appreciated. This episode features the first photographer to ever appear on Truth and Rhythm, Bruce Talamon, one of the most important shooters of African American music stars. From 1972 to 1982, he compiled thousands of great photos working for Soul newspaper and as a contractor for record labels and musical acts. He went on to shoot stills for several top TV shows and feature films, as well as Time magazine, and he also released a Bob Marley book. However, 2018's Soul R&B Funk Photographs 1972 to 1982, a heavy, oversized 376-page coffee table book, has set a new standard for capturing the visual side of that amazing period of music making and legendary artists. It is especially heavy on Parliament-Funkadelic and Bootsy, Stevie Wonder, who graces the cover, Chaka Khan, Marvin Gaye, Donna Summer, Earth, Wind & Fire, who Talamon toured with. He toured the world with Earth, Wind & Fire in the late 70s, Aretha Franklin, James Brown, and also historic events like the Funk Fest at LA's Memorial Coliseum, and so much more. Many of the photos had never been seen before that book came out. The book is frankly a breathtaking landmark. Highly recommended. Here, with Truth and Rhythm, Talamon reflects on his photographic journey and the magnitude of his work, with lots of stories about working with music's magicians in between. So let's go back to a time when funk and soul performers were larger than life, a time when there was no internet or smartphone cameras. This was the time when Bruce Talamon's lens was one of the only shining lights on music royalty, preserving their grandeur for generations to come. Enjoy. I'm delighted to welcome to the Truth and Rhythm mothership, Bruce Talamon, a renowned photographer for music artists, numerous publications, and the motion picture industry. His amazing decades-long career includes being a primary photojournalist for Soul newspaper during the 1970s, and last year he released the gorgeous coffee table book, Soul R&B Funk. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
My pleasure. And you're coming to us from Los Angeles area, is that right?
Yes, I am. Yeah, this is where I live.
Well, I understand you're a native, and I am too, although I've relocated, but always good to talk to a native.
Well, thanks. Yeah, been everywhere else, but I've always come back to Los Angeles, even, after spending great time in various cities across the United States, and then in around the world. My photography, my cameras have taken me everywhere, and that's been really kind of cool.
Well, you can't see me, but I'm wearing my trademark Los Angeles Lakers cap, so I still, keep the faith, even though.
All right, all right. Well, we can get into that later.
So, it's an honor to speak with you. I grew up being a big fan of Soul newspaper. I would, look at it faithfully when it would come out because, it was really the only publication that was basically serving that market. And that was my love and passion, was that music. So I have several copies still. They're kind of packed away, but it's great to finally meet the person behind the lens of so many of those great images. So welcome aboard.
Well, thanks. I've got to say that, I started there in 1973. I think was my first official assignment, and I was dropped off on the doorstep of this woman named Regina Jones, who was not only the photo editor, but the publisher for Soul newspaper. And they had been publishing since, I think, 1966, if I'm not mistaken, after what we call the Watts Rebellion happened. She and her husband, Ken Jones, understood that there was a whole underserved market, young, especially young black kids who were not seeing representational images, in the music and that type of a thing with their artists, with our artists, and so she was trying to do that. They knew that black kids would buy a magazine or a newspaper. They started out actually as a magazine, and then they ended up as a newspaper. But they understood that these kids would buy this magazine that was talking about who was doing the music, how it was being produced, where it was being produced, sort of the backstory and the performances and the reviews. And we were in the right place because everybody came to Los Angeles. So, there you go. I mean, from there, I ended up working with all the major record companies, and I actually ended up working on Soul Train. But all of that started from Regina Jones and Ken taking a chance on me, and I stayed there for 10 years. I did other things, but because she was very upfront. They really didn't have a big budget, but she gave me opportunity. She gave a number of photographers and writers opportunity, and those were probably, when I look back on it, some of the best days that we had, and they were wonderful because we had an access. We had to work and be professional. She taught us that whole thing of a responsibility of a journalist. And this was great for a young 20 some odd year old kid. I was just out of college, and like I talk about in the book, Leonard Pitts, who was just out of college. He was out of SC. I went to Whittier College, but you had Leonard Pitts, who went on to get a Pulitzer, but he got his training. He got his Pulitzer with the Miami Herald, but he got his training on Stevie Wonder and Parliament-Funkadelic and Marvin Gaye and Aretha and all of that. And Regina was very strict, and she was a taskmaster. We had to do our homework. You just couldn't come in there and think you were going to be loved and adored. You had to do your homework.
And what first pushed you towards photography? I know that you were originally thinking you were going to go another path.
Well, basically it boiled down to I loved the immediacy of photography, and I loved the storytelling component. It was never, photography has never been just pretty pictures for me. Okay, a lot of people, it's a visual record. It's you capture a moment. You capture a moment that's fleeting, and it's so you have this visual representation. I was trained as a political science student and sociologist. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to work, in that direction. And but when I found the storytelling capability, that was still sort of in my background as far as political science, sociology, history. I was reminded of the griot, Griot. If you don't know what it is, look it up. But it's basically, the storyteller, the one who keeps the traditions of the tribe, the clan, the group. They write down the stories. They might paint the pictures, the highlights, the setbacks of early civilizations, and so that when I saw what that was, it opened up another a whole nother world for me. So I took it upon myself. I mean, they say there's arrogance in youth, but I took it upon myself to document, musicians and artists who were black, as I am, and I had the audacity to think that if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. I mean, and like I say, the audacity of youth sometimes can overwhelm us and be a burden. But it was something that I felt I had to do, and I just lucked up in meeting some people who helped me do that. And now, 40 some odd years later, we have this visual record that, as it turns out, is probably one of the most important visual archives, because not only of the depth, and scope, but quite frankly, nobody else was doing that. Nobody else had the access because of the unique situation that, I mean, there was this confluence of, like they say, like a perfect storm. Look, I'm a great photographer. Ask me, I'll tell you. But seriously, right? I had access, so that meant that I was backstage at the recording sessions or the concerts, or the publicity sessions, participating in that, and so I was doing it at all different angles, and for instance, again, getting back to Soul Newspaper, you've got to understand, we were an extremely small and poor publication. So Regina was ripe for the pickings from the record companies who would say, we'll give you a handout. You don't have to we'll give you a handout story, and we'll give you a handout photograph, which meant that all they had to do was take a story that some publicist had done, and some canned story, and just republish it. I've seen small African American papers do that today, and there's nothing more embarrassing than seeing that they also included at the bottom. It says, and for other information, contact so and so in the publicity department at whatever magazine it is, or not magazine, record company, or a publicity company, and she did not want to participate in that. She wanted to discover her own stories and ask her own questions. And she also said that if they did not allow her to use her photographers and writers, then they couldn't have or take advantage of her audience, this African American audience. That was also just larger than just African Americans, but this audience that the record companies were thirsting to get a hold of, to be put in front of, to have a Donna Summer on the cover of Soul newspaper, because quite frankly, Donna Summer was not getting the traction that she did later, but she was not getting the traction from the Black community, until later in her career. And there were a number of other ones like that. And so these record companies knew they had to make that effort. So the reason that this was important to me was because one of my associates, the great photographer Bobby Holland, and was the one who convinced me as the photo editor that Regina should buy us some lights and backdrops, and then we could do proper covers, Scott. We could do proper documentation. And then Regina, because she couldn't pay us, she also let us use the lights when we were doing our other gigs, for the record companies and stuff. So it was a wonderful, wonderful relationship, and she was extremely tolerant. There's not a lot of people who would do that. But what this did was, all of a sudden, this created a situation where I was everywhere. I was getting recognized by the publicists for the record companies, and so they would then call me and hire me to photograph their acts, and I would have, again, this total access. So all of a sudden, like they say, drip by drip, piece by piece, I was accumulating an enormous archive. And again, even in some situations, the white photographers weren't shooting these acts, and it wasn't out of anything sinister. It was economic. They were not. Why would a photographer go out and photograph back then? Photograph an act where he knew that he couldn't get it published. So if Rolling Stone and Cream weren't doing the Whispers or the Delphonics or LTD or the Dramatics or Billy Paul, you see where I'm going with this? They would not go out and shoot it. So me and Bobby and a couple of other guys, Roland Charles, we were the ones that had this sort of had this clear field. And we were doing it, and again, we were doing it consistently. So that's how I ended up with this amazing archive, which after I stopped in 1982, basically was put away, and the way it sort of came about that we ended up with a book was that Maurice White, who I had worked with extensively, 1978, 79, 1977, 78, 79, and 80, and 81, actually. Maurice White was doing his biography with a fellow named Herb Powell, a writer and musician out of Los Angeles, and Reese told Herb to contact me because I had the best Earth, Wind, and Fire photographs. I had gone around the world with Earth, Wind, and Fire 3 times as the tour photographer and also documentarian, visual documentarian, and sort of keeper of the visual history of EWF. And so Reese suggested that Herb call me, and we made a deal for the biography photos. And then Herb Powell asked that fateful question. That was in 2014. He said, "Well, so what else you got back there?" And so I, started pulling out. Well, I've got a little Stevie, I've got a little Marvin Gaye, I've got some Parliament-Funkadelic and Bootsy Collins and Brothers Johnson and Rick James. And, all of a sudden, the dining room table is full of all these files. And he looked at me and he said, you've got a book here. And that's when I fell down the rabbit hole.
How did you ensure that you maintained the rights to your photos? And did you take a bunch that also you don't have in your possession?
So I basically have everything. Not even basically, I have everything that I photographed. You got to understand, this was a time before the lawyers started asking about asking for buyouts. So that never came up. You had your negatives. I had my negatives on file. My client and I established, early on top of that, you call me, my negatives are on in my files. My lab will make you a print. You can pick it up. Okay. Also, Regina was nice enough where, she didn't have a big budget, but she bought, she paid for processing sometimes, and she was generous in that sense where sometimes she bought our film, right? So it was a situation where we owned all of our stuff, and she established that we had that understanding, and so see, I got out just when the lawyers were starting to realize that nasty little word called content, that they could use something over and over again, and why pay for it twice? But it used to be that when you worked for a publicity company or a record company, you had you could, okay, the best way to describe it is that you could, okay, so you did a job for a publicity session, and then if the people in what do you call that, in A&R needed a photo for Cashbox, okay, then they called you up, and then they paid you for that licensing that photograph in Cashbox. You understand where I'm going with that? So, and then later, that's when the lawyers kept saying, well, wait a minute, why are we paying for this twice? Well, because you don't own it. All right. And then that's when they started doing buyouts. And I feel for the young photographers today who, they go on a job and then someone throws a buyout in front of their face and they say, well, that thing that you did for, $200 or $150, that's it. And that was never done during the time that I was working.
Well, it's
You
great.
know,
It's great, Bruce, that you were able to do that at that time because, ironically, so many of the recording artists during that same era, lost their publishing or didn't have that covered, and but it's great that you didn't run into that on your end of things. So
well, and the other thing is, I mean, this was, the great photographers. I mean, like Jim Marshall. I call him the slightly unhinged rock and roll photographer who shot Jimmy and Janice at Monterey and then at Woodstock, and did Miles Davis and it was the same thing. He didn't, in those years, there was you did a job. You made prints. You sent them prints. You didn't send them your negatives. And there was you were a freelance. Howard Bingham, a freelance. Who did all of the great Muhammad Ali work. But you worked for Sports Illustrated. You worked for Time Magazine, as I did later. You might send the whole take in, but then they sent it back to you. All right. That's just what was done. If they had something, they made a copy of it. Okay. So, that was, that was a time when, a lot of people didn't know the importance of this. I mean, I know of situations where companies were throwing negatives out. I mean, I cringe at that. Some of the record companies that just nobody's going to use that again, and they threw stuff out from the 50s and the 60s and I mean, that's one of those things that happen. I mean, they even do that today, where they do an edit and then a first edit, and they don't think that, well, maybe there's something that you might have overlooked, and so it's really sad, but the visual image has never been respected in most cases as it should be, and Scott, I mean, it's a shame, and also though there's photographers had a responsibility to also dictate terms, like on an invoice, to put, that this particular assignment is for this use and this use only. All other rights are reserved. Photographer must be contacted to negotiate an additional fee for an additional use. I mean, there were people doing stuff like that, and I luckily had some people who helped me. I mean, one of the things I'll say is that back when I was doing it, photographers talked. So often people didn't think that we talked with each other, that everybody just sort of stood, jealously guarding, whatever they had done or whatever they had. And but we talked, and so when it came to issues like copyright and stuff like that, I mean, these are things where folks talked. The thing that surprises me today is there are still a number of what you would consider to be world-class photographers who, when you talk to them about protecting their rights and protecting their work, they say, "Oh, I'm an artist. I don't have time for that." Really? I mean, really? So shame on them, because it's something that we as professional photographers and writers, have to take responsibility for.
Absolutely.
And look, I mean, I'm sure I've grown in the way that I work now, and the advantage of age, sort of has something to do with that. But I mean, I'm self-taught, but that didn't stop me from learning all the time. Okay, I knew nothing about photography when I picked up a camera the first time, and who knew that 2 years later I'd be in the middle of photographing some of the most important acts in American history. But I was always trying to make sure that I knew my craft, and even if it was for the or inspired by the simplest instinct, which was not to be embarrassed. Okay, but I didn't want to embarrass Regina. I'll never forget 1973. I'm newly hired, but I cleaned up well, so she sent me on a press junket in 1973 to photograph the Supremes in Japan, and for with Motown Records, and I wrote the story and shot the images. Now this was the Jean Terrell Supremes. Okay, she had just taken over from Diana, but I had the responsibility of coming back with photographs that would represent Soul newspaper and that we could tell a story from, right? And so, I mean, years later, I like to tell people, about the time that Arnold Drafkin, the famous photo editor for Time magazine, in 1984, I'm working for him. I'm a contract photographer working for him on the Democratic the Democratic primaries in 1984. I was assigned to cover Jesse Jackson, and I remember he wasn't directing the comment at me, but he just said it, and I knew that it applied. But he says, there's never any excuse for not coming back with the shot. That's all he said. But I understood what he meant. You call yourself a professional, then you better come back with the shot, or else you will be replaced. And that's what people need to understand. We weren't out there playing and having a good time. I mean, there was another piece of advice, solid advice, that the head of Motown's publicity gave me when he first hired me. He hired me in 1974, Thelma Houston at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. And basically what I had to do was go backstage, and he didn't even care about the performance, but I had to go backstage and photograph the president of Motown, who was going to be there, because that would be Berry Gordy, and he had his entourage with him. And I had to get pictures with Barry and with Thelma, and so they could use that in Billboard magazine. So there was a specific thing that he needed. And but I'll never forget, he told me as he started to hire me more after that, he said, just remember, you're not the fifth Beatle. Okay? You understand what I'm saying there? Just remember, you're not part of the band. And that was always I've held that to be true throughout my photographic career.
Always be a professional.
Yeah, you got to be professional, and you're not friends with these people, right? You can be friendly, but you're there to do a job. So that means you can't get high with Bob Marley, all right? So July or Parliament. Now, if you happen to be in the room that is covered in a fog, you can inhale, but you know, I got to tell you, you have to do your job. All right, and I think that, I mean, I've seen a lot of photographs. You know, people have shown me, you know, where they've, you know, gotten a little bit of access or you know, and a lot of times, you know, it's disappointing because they had the access, but they didn't know how to operate the camera, or they didn't know how to use that lens properly, or they didn't know how to, you know, the proper film to have, and so that opportunity was wasted and gone, you know. So we were always, you know, I remember when I got my first assignment to photograph Earth, Wind and Fire in a studio setting, and I talk about it in the book. And by the way, it's a Taschen book, Taschen Publishers, and we do have it for sale. But you know, it was a situation where you know, Earth, Wind and Fire, the biggest band in the world, was coming to our little studio, and I'm just about to tell you this tale, and the mailman is coming up to my door, and my dogs are going to freak out now. So just let's pause. Can we pause for a minute?
Yeah, I'll edit this out.
All right, hold on. Hold on. Okay, mailman's gone. I have two rescue dogs who don't understand that they won the lottery, right? So they
Hey, as long as we're interrupted here, I want to make sure that I want to ask you about a few of the artists specifically. So
okay,
yeah.
I just want to let me just tell you this little piece about Earth, Wind and Fire, and then you can edit it down any way you want.
You got it.
Okay, back on.
Yes.
All right. So I remember that, you know, the time that I the first time that Earth, Wind and Fire came to our studio, and that was in 1977, May 1977, and you know, we had a DJ. We had, you know, their music playing. We had food there, right? And they really appreciated it. They ended up staying about 4 or 5 hours, and afterwards, the road manager for Earth, Wind and Fire called me up, and he said, you know, Reese really liked the way you handled yourself. Okay, and he said, you know, we'd like to see if you'd like to go on the road with us. We're going to go to Egypt. No, we're going to go to Europe, Egypt, and Japan. Would you like to come along? And so there, you know, that's how I fell down the rabbit hole with Earth, Wind and Fire. But what I'm saying is, you know, I was prepared. I had, you know, done my homework, even down to what food they ate or couldn't eat, right? So I had something for everybody. Like I said, we set the mood. That's what we would do back then. So anyway, you had questions about specific things.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, you know, viewers of this show, there's certain artists that are real heroes. I mean, mostly all the artists that are in your book are, but you know, we don't have you know, days to talk here. So I'll try to zero in on a few if you'll humor me with those.
Absolutely.
George Clinton and Parliament-Funkadelic. What can you tell us about those experiences, shooting those great shots and just hanging out with those guys?
You know, when I think back about 1977, when I basically was first introduced to Parliament, it was, it was just a magical time. There was so much happening. I mean, you had the later on in 77, in the summer of 77, you had the P-Funk Earth tours. People don't understand. They don't give George credit, or as much credit as he truly deserves. When you think about, this guy was creating a black rock opera. He was creating what I call, a situation where you had they had stadiums that they were filling. You're talking about 150,000 people at one swipe there to see Parliament-Funkadelic and Bootsy and Chaka Khan and the Isley Brothers and the Brothers Johnson and you had, and I call this, this was like rock and roll. This was like Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This was like the Rolling Stones. This was like Fleetwood Mac. Stadiums full. But I say that this was R&B dipped in funk. This was rock and roll R&B dipped in funk, courtesy of George Clinton. Of course, you had the 20,000 seaters, the 18,000 seaters. Like, I photographed him earlier, at the LA Sports Arena, the Los Angeles, the Inglewood Forum, and numerous times. And when I think back, I mean, the stuff at the excuse me, the stuff at the Los Angeles Sports Arena, which is now gone. There's a soccer stadium there. The sports arena stuff was very important because that's where we have what has become sort of the signature group photo of Parliament. I'm kind of pleased to say that I have two of the biggest bands in the world. I did the publicity pictures that people seem to use or want to use or when they think about them, and that's Earth, Wind and Fire and Parliament. And just give you a little background, the road managers at the time for Parliament were Archie Ivy and Tom Vickers, and we are still friends to this day. And Archie had been a contributor and writer to Soul newspaper. So that's how I knew Archie. And he was on the music scene. And then I didn't know Tom at the time, but Tom and Archie got gobbled up by the mothership in Area 51, probably sometime around 76 or so. I mean, you could talk to them for an exact date, but the funny thing is that both of them had been on an assignment for a magazine. I think Tom was out with for Rolling Stone when he went out with George and them, and then Archie was doing a piece for Soul newspaper, and like I said, George kept the door closed when it was time to leave, but seriously, they called me and they said, we need a publicity photo of the band. And I think the band was on Casablanca records at the time, if I'm not mistaken. And so it was supposed to go like this. Bruce, you'll have 10 minutes or so The band is going to get dressed, in their regalia, and they will proceed from the dressing room to your spot where you're going to photograph them, and then they will, from there, after you've got a few shots, we'll go outside. And so we were all set up. Bobby and I were all set up, and we were in a broom closet. Now, mind you, it was a larger than normal broom closet, but it was still a damn broom closet that we had moved stuff around. And we had a 9-foot backdrop that we extended to 13 feet. And because I knew, we had I don't know, 12 or so people. I think we had 13 folks that were going to be in this photograph. And so at the appointed time, we're ready. The lights are had all been checked, and we'd taken a Polaroid, and everything looked good. And that's what you did back then. You couldn't look in the back of your camera like you could now to know that everything was dialed in. You were shooting Kodachrome, and you were basically shooting it blind. So what you did was you would shoot a Polaroid, and then that was the same film speed, and then based on how that Polaroid looked, you would open up your shutter, or not your shutter, but your aperture. And so, and you were shooting, on one shoulder you had color, on the other shoulder you had black and white with a corresponding, lens, like, a 50 or an 85. And I knew we were probably going to be stuck with using just a 50 because, again, you had 13 people that you had to, force onto this seamless. And so they come and you've got to remember as a photographer, you got to understand, you gotta take charge. They will, no matter how important they are, when they get in front of that camera, they will defer to you 99% of the time. But you have to give direction. And, and you have to take charge and basically sort of curate the photograph. What do I mean by that? You gotta place people strategically. And the easiest way, of course, is, you put the smaller guys in front, you put someone, if they're interesting, in the middle, you kind of build from there. And that's what we did. Maybe you use what they call an apple box or a crate or a ladder for somebody in the back row, because everybody's basically the same size. But you do put the taller guys in the back, and you might tell somebody, hey, lean against so-and-so, cross your legs, turn your back and look over your shoulder. And that's the way we got into it. Now, I did not factor in the fact that you had 12 people trying to wrestle him onto a background, and they're high. And not only that, but they've got 20,000 screaming fans, and the whole room is rocking because they want to hear him, and they want to hear him now. And but they were extremely gracious, and everybody just sort of fell into their rhythm. I mean, Gary and Boogie and everybody, and George and George knew the importance of this, and so he said, "Come on, y'all, we can't be fucking around." And the picture just came together. And Scott, I gotta say, when I look back on that session, I mean, I held him for about 5 rolls of film, and remember, you've got 36 exposures, so you've got to rewind and reload. And Bobby was reloading, and I was shooting, and first you'd shoot color, then you shoot black and white, and because back in those days, you didn't have Photoshop to I mean, you could, shoot an internet, and then you create a black and white, but you generally didn't do that. And but we shot, and the best thing I can say to you is it was delicious. You know, I mean, when I look back on that stuff, and really the stuff that you saw in the book, that was stuff that I had missed. You know, I mean, I didn't think it was as good as it was. Maybe I had gotten just fatigued looking through the loop when I was making my first selects, but I didn't select those when I used those, and you know, you see that color picture, you know, it just you know, the funk just resonates. I mean, when you see it, and again, George loved what I did, and I had total access from then on anytime they were in town. And let me say this, I had finished, this was in the 90s. Years later, George was playing at the Hollywood, no, where the hell was he? I want to say the Hollywood Palladium, but it wasn't.
Was it Universal?
No. This was in the 90s, and it was in Los Angeles. It's on Vine Street. There was this
Palladium?
club.
Palladium?
Not the Palladium.
Palace?
Not the Hollywood. The Hollywood Palace.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what it was. And I came with, you know, I bought a ticket. I came with a camera. I had a sport coat and tie on. And I worked my way up to the front. And George is, you know, playing to the crowd as usual. And we hadn't seen each other in, I don't know, 15 years. And he looks, and then he stops, and he does a double take. And he just waves me on into the back. He was like, come on in the back. And he had remembered. Then I shot the second show, and I was on the stage with him, and it was like old times. We just had a great reunion. But, you know, and I've seen him since, and I know he loves the book, and I know he loves the photographs, because that's the sad thing about this book is, if there's anything to be sad about, so many of those people are gone now.
Yes.
They're gone.
Yep.
You know, and I mean, you know, Gary's gone, Boogie's gone,
Bernie
Debbie's
Worrell.
gone.
Bernie Worrell. Yep.
Bernie, you know, he's gone. Bernie Worrell. I mean, you know, and there's a couple others, you know, and I want my pictures to show, you know, somebody that not only were these guys badass, but they were having a great time. They knew their instruments. You know, there's a great line from this musician named Eric Dolphy, who was this fabulous bass clarinet player, and he also played saxophone. And he was a jazz musician, and he says, you know, when you hear music, it's in the air. You can never capture it again. And in a sense, that's what it is about the photographs. You were able to capture it because once you see it, it's gone, and you can never capture it again. But these are moments. These are moments that we can look back on and see how badass, you know, Maurice White was, or Aretha, or Natalie Cole, or Donna Summer, or Parliament. I mean, you know, that band's not coming around again. I don't care how good the next one is, you know, or the new iteration of his. You know, it's something. I mean, when you look at, I mean, I remember photographing George. I photographed George a number of times. I mean, I've got enough stuff from that period, you know, to do more. You know, but you know, there was only so much room. I mean, we ended up, the book was supposed to be 300 pages, and then it went to 350 pages, and then it went to 300, I think, 70 some odd pages, You know, we went from we had, shall I say, discussions about who went in the book, who didn't make the cut. You know, there were people that I had to lobby for. I had to tell them, you know, they had to understand they needed, you know, you couldn't just have Lewis Johnson. This was not a brother named Johnson. This was the brothers Johnson. And so you had to have, you know, both of the brothers Johnson. You know, you had to have Peebo. I know a bunch of women who would have shot my ass if I didn't have Peebo Bryson in that book. Okay, you know, I mean, you had to have LTD. You had to have, of course, you had to have Bootsy, but you needed to make sure that you had Maceo and Fred Wesley working it out with James, you know, and the same thing with so many of these acts. You know, you had to have Billy Paul. You had to have the Whispers, and unfortunately, the Whispers didn't make it. You know, I could only win so many battles. You know, the guy was like, you know, they were like, well, we don't want this to be encyclopedic. They didn't understand the importance, I don't think, until later. You know, they knew it was important, but they didn't understand that this had never been done before. I sold this book on the phrase, or not the phrase, but just the understanding that there had been books, you know, photo books done on Rolling Stones, rock and roll, Elvis, David Bowie, okay? But up until that point, there had never been a photo book done on soul, R&B, and funk. You cannot find one. Yep. This is the first of its kind. What? That's a bold statement. That's a hell of a statement, but that also speaks to, you know, how undervalued, how underrepresented, how marginalized these musicians were.
There's no question, Bruce. Another great example that I have to interject is when records turned to CDs, you could not even find most of those artists' works on CD. It took years for the companies to actually put out those great works. In a lot of cases, you know, you'd only find like a compilation, but not the original works because they were also marginalized with the music itself.
Oh, that's true. No, that's very true.